bacon and tin foil over wood fire. So you just get a good hot fire going, put the tin foil wrapped fish in the coals, cover the coals, leave them there for a half an hour, and you got a nice salmon bed. The other two fish that you get up in these waters, one is the Arctic grayling, which is kind of dull and drab when you take it out of the water, but it has this iridescent blues and greens, and a great big sail fin that makes it a really pretty fish. But they're generally taste just like a rainbow trout or something. Not really as rich and oily as a trout. And then there's the lake trout on some of these lakes, but it's a pretty different subspecies because it's been separated by the glaciers from the rest of North America for probably 1 million or more years. So it's a distinctly different looking fish, but still classified as lake trout. Then there's the wild. And it's just a matter of fact that every time I take pictures really close to grizzlies, I have a hard time keeping the camera still. The pictures are always a little bit fuzzy, and I think I know where that comes from. But this is a case we were walking down the river, and Barry jumped up. Barry was 50 feet away, and it happened well. A couple other typical grizzly encounters. The one on the top right was kind of an interesting situation because we walked into a pass that we wanted to go through, but there was no wind, and Mama Grizzly was just laying there nursing her cubs. And so we didn't want to startle her, but we ended up just going up on the hillside and having lunch and hoping eventually if the wind would bring our smell to her, she'd know we were there. But it took over an hour. She nursed the cubs, she fell asleep, and it's only when the cubs woke up and fought this ferocious battle right on top of her that she got up and detected our presence, and they left successfully. And this is Bear 1310. And my daughter wearing it as a hat. The skull. We found the skull, and next to it was a radio collar. Now, this is national park rules. Even though everybody wanted to keep the bear skull, we left it where we found it. We did take the radio collar and turned it into Alaska Fish and Game, and found out this was Bear 1310 that disappeared in 1987. And there was also a skull of a bear cub near her. And the Alaska Fish and Game people said that female bears are often killed by males that want to eat their cub. And that's what they happened to her. She died defending the cub. A hungry male wanted fresh meat. Surprisingly, even out on the tundra, there are lots of moose. And you wouldn't think it was a place to even hide, but you come through the willows, and here's a cow and her calf are scared. And notice you see all this dead willow. What's happened is that they've been living in this valley and eating the live willow down to the ground, and so all that's left is the dead stuff that's unpalatable to them. So they pretty much put themselves out of house and home. But the willows do manage to support these pretty big moose out there on the open tundra. And some of them can be pretty big. We found this. That animal must have weighed at least 50 pounds. So there's some big moose out there. And of course, caribou, we've seen the migration. This is a male caribou in the fall. He's still got some skin adhering to his antlers. One of my favorite creatures is the muskox. And they're just wonderful, shaggy creatures to see. You can get fairly close to them. Really interesting and primeval looking. The picture on the left was actually taken out of the airplane. We came over the hill, and the pilot was just about to touch down. He pulled back real hard and looked out the window, and there's this herd of muskox running below us. So we had to get them out of the area before we could land. And last year, on our way out of town, I was there a day early to organize supplies in this little Eskimo village. And the bush pilot's wife comes out and says, "We got a baby muskox coming in." And I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yeah, the Fish and Game just rescued it when his mother was being killed by the wolf, and they're bringing it in today to a wildlife park in Anchorage. And there's the baby." The state troopers brought him in on a plane. They said she was about 3 weeks old. And there she is on the right at her new game farm, and apparently doing very well. And then the other big wildlife is the Dow sheep. can see that the sun is coming almost directly out of the north. We're looking south into the mountains, and convective storms are collapsing. And one interesting byproduct of this is you get sunburn at places you never thought you'd get sunburn. Under your chin, back of your arms, because that sun is 360 degrees but at a low angle, and hitting you with some of the strangest places and doing it all day and all night. You get these quick summer snowstorms that dust the peaks, and look at these deep endless valleys. And finally, there's the fall foliage. You don't hear about it much, but the fall color in Alaska can be spectacular. And let's see, if you look in the middle of the picture, you can see a yellow dot and blue dot again. Those are our tiny little tents embedded in this huge landscape. And if you can get decent weather, the fall is, again, one of the great times of the year. You actually get a little darkness at night, and mosquitoes are pretty much frozen out. And so in the last week of August, you get the peak of the fall color, and you get the height of the Arctic char run. And if you can get some good weather, it's really spectacular. And you have blueberries. That time is just covered with blueberries. You can pick up as many as you stand. I take these instant cheesecake mixes, and then you make the cheesecake in a pan, and then you cover it with about 3 inches of blueberries. Fabulous dessert. So it's a landscape that's really memorable, and there's just so much of it. And there are trips where we literally do not see a sign that a human being existed the whole time we're out there. Not even an airplane flying over there, not even a contract. There's nothing but the country. And that can have some interesting things. That I forget what year it was, but sometime in the 90s, we came back and we rented a condominium unit in Fairbanks that's supposed to have just 2 people in 1 bedroom, but we had about 6 or 8 of us sleeping on the floor in there. But the problem is you got to take turns at the shower. So the lucky person got the shower and we flipped on cable TV, and every channel was BBC. And different shows, but they're all coming from BBC. And we thought the country would take it over by Britain. But it turns out that Princess Diana just died about an hour earlier. So every station was broadcasting from Britain to BBC and facilities of one sort or another. But it was certainly weird for a minute until we understood what the context was. So it's a great place to be, and I'm thankful I'm still able to keep going out there and doing this kind of stuff and enjoying the country. And we have to be prepared for the fact that if there's oil under the ground and there's big bucks to be made for taking it out, that subject is going to come up again. You can almost be sure of it. And I think, especially as they start getting so little oil out of Prudhoe Bay that they have to close down the pipeline, that the issue is really going to pop up big time again, and we're going to have to fight this battle all over again. So, as you noted your email on the DSCN amount, put a check by your email address, and I'll send you a PDF that describes a couple of these bush range trips, and you can get a feel for what it's like day to day to be on the ground and experience this kind of adventure. Yeah.
If the Anwar is a protected area now, how do we know there's oil there? I mean, we're not allowed to drill and see.
A little bit of seismic work was done, but most of it's just based on geology. Looking at the outline, there's full of sediments. You can see where they're digging under the ground. You can look at the lay of the land. But that's why the range of possibilities runs from 3 to 15. Phil Nelson took all the data that was available, some early seismics, a couple of drill holes around the edges, and he gave his best guess as to where there might be oil traps and what rocks they might be in, and how hard it might be to get that oil out of those rocks.
And all the existing wells are onshore.
I think, at Prudhoe Bay, the coast is so shallow, sloping, so there's a number of man-made islands there that we have to drill back. But they haven't drilled offshore, although they do have man-made islands. And then the Naval Petroleum Reserve turns out not to have much petroleum as far as anybody can tell. to set aside the 30th because some early geologists were flying over and said, wow, this looks just like Iran, you know, the surface terrain, and so they said, you know, they've got oil potential. But it's thin skin tectonics, so it was shoved over on top, so, I mean, no one dreamed that it was the actual edge of the continent itself that was the huge oil structure.
Fred, how do you know, how do you get your bearings? You know where you're going?
There's fairly good topo maps out there.
Oh, really?
And you just have to keep a sense as to what river you're on. But sometimes when you're trying to find a pass, you actually have to count the drainages that are coming in from the side to know that you're getting to what shows up as a pass on the map and not coming on a cliff you can't get down some other way. And then you have to balance that with the fact that we don't have to get anywhere. We're just out here to see the wilderness. You know, it's all good, even if we go to the wrong valley. And you can trust the caribou. They usually know the way to go.
But the pilot needs to know where you went.
Yeah, and he needs to, you have to be sure he knows how to pick you up. And they are required to keep a logbook so that if something should happen to them, somebody else will be able to figure out where they've got people that they have to pick up. And we've had certain problems. There was one year where we did a point A to point B, so we couldn't leave a food cache at where we came in. And a really bad storm came in, and we wound up at our pickup spot with no food left, and the pilot couldn't get us for 2 days. So we spent 2 days trying, you know, very hungry days. We shared a Cliff Bar for dinner amongst 8 people one night. But we did survive, and we ate well when we got out. We had another trip where we were coming into the pickup site the day before, and this plane we recognized as our pilot starts buzzing us, and then he lands at the pickup spot, and we hustle over to meet him. He says, there's a big storm coming, and I want to take you guys out tonight, not tomorrow morning. But the stranger one was in 2011, and now we have satellite phones. So the pilot says, I want to have a weather report from your site. So I called his hangar, and his wife answered, and I talked to her promptly at 8 o'clock, and she said, they're saddling up, they're heading out, they're on their way. And then by 3 or 4 in the afternoon, with no pilot and perfectly clear blue skies, I finally decided, well, I could kind of run down the battery a little more and call again. And I talked to Lyndon, and he said, you're not going to believe this. He said they were on their way, 2 planes, when the state troopers diverted them to go on a manhunt. He said, we've got some drunken native who's out there, and he's stolen a rifle and an ATV, and he's running around threatening to shoot people. We want to keep track of him from the air until we get the helicopters from Anchorage. So, and he eventually got us out that night.
What, do you use GPS for navigation?
I don't. I go by the topo sheets. It's mountainous country, and as long as you know what drainage you're on.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever broken a leg on all that?
No, the Sierra Club has had 1 fatality in Alaska in the whole time this program has gone. And that was a case where it was a high runoff season, and the leader, they had to get across, where they're supposed to get across a river, and the leader didn't like the way it looked, so he said, I'm going to go try it and see. And he got halfway out and realized, you know, this is impossible. And he turned around and started coming back, and he said something, and a woman who was with the trip didn't hear him very well and thought he was saying it was okay, and so she plowed right in and got swept away and drowned. And we had a near fatality in 2013. The Alaska subcommittee does trips in Canada too, and they had a trip in Canada where one of the participants was dragged out of his tent by a polar bear and had severe puncture wounds in his head and throat, but did survive.
Do you carry a gun?
We're not allowed to carry a gun. Our liability insurance says that unless we're in one of these parts of Canada where you're required to have a gun, you can't have one. And I think the reasoning is that, you know, panicky people with a gun are probably more dangerous than a bear. And they're probably right. So we carry flare guns, and that's what worked on polar bear. Got him to drop this person back off.
Bigger are these groups?
refuge, you're now restricted to 7 people per party. And that effectively means 6 because you go in groups of 3 and it's not economical to hire a whole plane for one other person. The cost is $600 per hour to fly. And so you do the math. If you're flying an hour in and it's an hour or so from Martin Village, that's $600, but then there's another $600 for the pilot to get back. And then there's another $1,200 to pick you up. So it's $2,400 for 3 people, or $800 a person is what you're paying for that part of the transportation. Now, one of the reasons that I happen to go into the refuge is that I go to areas outside the refuge where you can take 12. And so that's much more economical. You have to split the cost of the 2 leaders amongst a larger group of people.
So when you're out there, what are you doing all day?
Read one of my journals and find out. I go from camp to camp, and then we go over to one group will climb a mountain, one group will go fishing, one group will just go up on a hill and watch wildlife. And hopefully somebody will go out and spend the day picking a couple gallons of blueberries.
Have you been this year?
This year I went to Cape Cruises, which is actually a coastal site. It's where the Brooks Range goes into the ocean. We were there for first part of June.
You don't always go back to the same spot?
We have some standard routes. Usually, you'll do one 2 or 3 years in a row, and then you get kind of tired, and somebody else will take it over. I have been doing one on the headwaters of the Woolwich River from 2005 until 2011, and that trip still goes, but someone else is doing it this year. Next time Sierra Magazine comes out with all those trips listed, take a look at some of ours and see what we've got.
How cold is it at night?
It depends on what time of year you're there. In the June time, if you've got 24-hour sunlight, it's actually pretty warm. But it can get dropped down to maybe 35 or so and be drizzly, and that sure feels cold. Then you get this icy fog that's coming off the ocean, and it'll feel even colder. When you go in August and you get a clear night, it can drop down to 20 at night. But it's, the nights are only 3 or 4 hours. But if you got a clear sky, it drops like a rock. But then it's back up to 70 in the day. Powerful sun.
Do you take enough food for every day, or do you plan on having fish for the party?
Well, I never count on having fish. You have enough calories. There was one trip when when I was only the assistant leader and someone else was actually the leader. And I have a reputation for being able to find fish. And one morning, Wilbur got out the pack and said, "Let's skip breakfast." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, we need it for dinner." He said, "I had counted on you catching dinner for 2 meals." But it all worked out well because this terrific rainstorm came in and raised the river levels up so that the next day there were fish everywhere.
We watch a show on Sunday night called Mountain Man, and there's a guy that's a trapper up in Alaska, and he flies his own plane, and listen, it's just like, we get so into the story, and he freaks outside. And it's just incredible what this guy goes through to catch, fruit to stay on to the year.
I can remember a pilot's ground man, I forget how this came out, but he just mentioned that, yeah, when it's more than 50 degrees below zero, the kids can't go out and play. Just thinking what life might be like then. There's PBS shows it occasionally, but there's a program called One Man's Wilderness about a guy named Dick Predeke who built a cabin. And if of our Sierra Club trips actually met Dick Prenicky one of the last years he was at that cabin. They did a trip out of Lake Clark.
I realized that was well played.
Now, do you have to back everything back out when you leave the site?
Oh, yeah, we,
Take it all out?
we don't leave anything behind. We will pull the trash fire, primarily because we don't want to be carrying wrappers that are in touch with food or anything. So anything that's burnable, that's had peanut butter on it, or, and the tin foil we used to cook the fish, we burn that up really thoroughly to get all remnants we can, and then ball it up and put it in a plastic bag and put it away. And we bring back the toilet paper, try to practice as much ruleless ethic as we can. And occasionally, these landing spots, other people will use, so we may find some tin cans or something. The pilots are off the saw. We'll take that with us too.
How old is the eldest person you think?
I had a woman on this trip who was 72. She was a great hiker this year. It's hard to judge people. I had one guy that I was almost going to refuse to take because he had crutches. But, you know, so I asked him about it. He said, oh, no, I said, I had my knees replaced a couple years ago, and he found out these are better than a cane. And he was a great hiker, but he used crutches instead of walking sticks.
Tell us how you got involved with Sierra and going to Alaska. Your first involvement, how did you?
I took a Sierra Club trip because I always wanted to go to Alaska, and I had a good time and bonded well with the leader. He said, you know, you ought to think about working with me on some future trips as a volunteer. And so I did. And actually, because I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, it was difficult to get approval to do anything formally with the Sierra Club because we're supposed to be impartial on environmental issues. So for a number of years, I was going on trips with other Sierra Club people where we just pool our resources and do a scouting trip to try and find a new route or a place to go. So a lot of our trips were not officially Sierra Club sponsored trips, but still with the Sierra Club mafia, so to speak. Yeah.
Do you think that this area is more valuable for the energy extraction, or should it be kept relatively inviolate what we can as a lab and a baseline study for the future of both the planet and where else we may go?
Well, one way to look at this is to say, well, let's assume you have this valuable commodity buried in your backyard. I mean, you know exactly where it is, and you know if you dig it up and sell it, you're going to get a lot of money, and you can put it in the bank, and inflation will eat it up. But it's such a rare resource, if you leave it in the ground, the value is going to increase much faster than inflation. Okay? Unless you really need to have that money, what's the most rational thing to do? It's just to hold on to it and let it become ever more valuable.
Mm. Yeah, the whole concept of saying we want to be energy independent is actually causing the opposite. The sooner we get U.S. soil depleted totally of those resources, even though we're using non-toxic sources of electricity and so forth in the future, there will be some need for that oil. And it will still, as you say, it will get more valuable. So logically, we'd be buying it from overseas and hoarding our own. Yeah.
So it just seems crazy to take it out of the ground, burn it up, and tear up the landscape.
With emphasis on tearing the landscape. Yeah.
Especially when there's, I've been going to Alaska long enough to actually see the effects of development, and especially around Anchorage and Wasilla and Palmer. You can see the country changing.
Do you think we'll ever reach a stage in which we're actually parallel to the planet and the universe instead of ramming into it head on?
Well, you know, there's a number of things out there waiting to bite us. I mean, Yellowstone, every time Yellowstone blows up, it wipes out the entire half of North America. And, you know, it only does it every 500,000 years, but the last time it did it was 500,000 years ago. So we're going to be due for for another Huckleberry Tough.
Well, we're at least, maybe we're teenagers by now.
And, you know, if you want an idea of how bad it can be, there's a park called Ash Falls State Park in Nebraska, eastern Nebraska. And an entire herd of hippopotamus-like animals were suffocated by the ash from Yellowstone. And you can see the skeletons laid out on the ground. So 1,000 miles away from the epicenter. Okay, well, thanks for listening to my story, and if you put a check by your email, I'll send you a couple of illustrated journals.
Did everyone get a sign-in sheet?
I want to put mine in with it, please.
I thought you know.
I'll put it down here again.
If we're already getting your email, that's good for that, right? Or do you need a,
Well, I think this is something different from,
oh, it's different.
this is the Sierra Club, not the
Sierra.
Ozark Society.
Oh, okay.
Although I advertised it through the Ozark Society and the Geosciences Department and everybody else.
I don't think it's any accident that most of this demographic that's here has lived long enough to digest their experience.
And I can also testify, I've been backpacking in Siberia too, and I can tell you it's just like Alaska, except a lot harder to get to. and they always make you drink vodka. Or berate you for only drinking beer and being a non-drinker.
You going back again next year?
So now, we have to have our next trip roughed out this week.
Let's thank Fred. That was really good. Great work. I just wanted to introduce myself and talk a little bit about what's going on with Sierra Club. I'm Glenn Hooks, and I'm the chapter director for Sierra Club out of the Little Rock office. And I'm really happy to be invited up here to hear this great program and to meet some of you folks. Now, before I talk a little bit about this, I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions just so I can get an idea of who's in the room. How many of you are actually dues-paying members of the Sierra Club? It's a little mixed, but I know that we have been trying up here, maybe for this particular program, to maybe broaden the communication a little bit in the community and let you know about this program, and I think we'll continue to try to shape that a little bit better. Could I ask folks that are not Sierra Club members how you found out about tonight's program? Anybody else want to get Fred?
I advertised for the Ozark Society and through the Geosciences Department.
Okay, that's the way most people, okay, great. Well, I think that Cammie, your local chair, is committed to the idea of really kind of broadening our outreach a little bit and really working to involve the community a little bit more, so I wanted to make sure that I understood that. And the last question that